This computer costs $600 million, handles classified nuclear weapons work for the United States government, and it does not use Windows. It would never use Windows. The machine that runs everything. That computer is El Capitan, currently the fastest supercomputer on Earth. It runs on Linux. Frontier, the second fastest, used to model everything from subatomic particles to entire galaxies, it runs Linux. Every single machine on the global top 500 supercomputer list runs Linux. Not one uses Windows. Not one uses Mac. And it is not just supercomputers. The backbone of the internet runs on Linux. AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, all three of the world's dominant cloud platforms run on Linux. 90% of IBM's mainframe customers use Linux. The International Space Station switched its laptops from Windows XP to Linux because the engineers decided stability and control were non-negotiable when you are orbiting 350 kilometers above the Earth. Your Android phone runs Linux. The router delivering your internet connection runs Linux. Most of the smart televisions, streaming devices, and internet-connected hardware in your home runs Linux. The February 2026 survey from W3 Techs shows Linux powering 60.8% of all websites on the internet. Linux runs the world. And yet when you walk into a store to buy a laptop, every shelf is dominated by Windows and Mac. Linux is so invisible to the average consumer that most people have never made a conscious choice about it one way or the other. That is not an accident. That is the result of one of the most effective business maneuvers in the history of technology. Where it started? The two universes. To understand how this happened, you need to understand that computing in the 1960s and 1970s existed in two completely separate universes that never interacted. Universe 1 was serious computing. Universities, labs, major corporations, government agencies, these environments ran machines that cost as much as houses and required entire buildings to house them. The operating system for this universe was Unix, built at Bell Labs around 1969. Unix was designed from the ground up for environments where dozens of people needed to use the same machine simultaneously. It was multi-user, multitasking, stable, and portable across different hardware architectures. It was powerful and customizable in a way that no other system matched. Universe 2 was the personal computer, a completely different world that barely existed before the late 1970s. IBM, Microsoft, Apple, and others were building machines for individuals sitting at desks rather than for research departments. The operating system for this universe was MS-DOS, simpler, command-line-based, built for the limited hardware of the era. Then, Apple introduced the graphical interface and the idea that a computer could be an appliance rather than a tool requiring technical expertise. Microsoft responded with Windows. Both focused on usability, not power. Both decided accessibility mattered more than control. These two universes existed in parallel for years. Unix had power, but not accessibility. Windows and Mac had accessibility, but not the raw control that serious computing demanded. Then in 1991, a 21-year-old computer science student in Helsinki named Linus Torvalds had a specific and simple thought. He had used Unix at university. He was now at home with a personal computer running MS-DOS. He wanted Unix power on a PC. So he built it. How Linux actually happened. Torvalds posted to an online newsgroup with a message that has become one of the most famous understatements in computing history. He said he was doing a free operating system. Just a hobby, he said. Won't be big and professional. He then made two decisions that changed everything. He released it as a free download, and he released the source code so anyone could modify it. At the same time, a project called GNU had been building a complete free Unix-compatible operating system since 1983. Richard Stallman's vision was software that users could run, study, modify, and share without restriction. GNU had built almost everything required for a complete operating system: a compiler, command line tools, shells, and libraries. The one thing it did not have was a kernel. A kernel is the core component that sits between software and physical hardware and manages every resource the system has. You cannot have an operating system without one. Torvalds' kernel was exactly what GNU needed. When the Linux kernel combined with the GNU tools, a complete operating system existed for the first time. It could run on ordinary personal computers. It was free, the source code was open, and it had all the power and architecture of the Unix systems that serious computing had been built on. The growth that followed was immediate and explosive. By the late 1990s, Linux had evolved from a hobby project in a student's bedroom to the dominant operating system for internet servers. Companies building the early web infrastructure needed machines that ran continuously, handled multiple users, spoke the language of networks, and could be customized for unusual hardware and unusual workloads. Linux was essentially built for exactly that requirement. It ended the reign of proprietary Unix in corporate data centers, and IBM, HP, and other major hardware companies started contributing code to Linux development and sponsoring its growth. The business heist. How Microsoft locked the desktop. Here is the part that most technology histories skip over because it is less comfortable than the story of innovation winning on merit. Linux did not lose the desktop because it could not compete with Windows on usability. A user-friendly layer built on top of Linux would have been entirely achievable. Linux lost the desktop because it was never a fair fight. Microsoft did not win users through superior product design alone. Microsoft won factories. The mechanism was a contract structure called per-processor licensing, and it worked like this. By the time Linux started gaining real momentum in the early 1990s, Microsoft was already deeply embedded with PC manufacturers. Windows had launched before Linux existed. It was familiar to consumers. PC manufacturers needed to sell machines that customers would recognize, which meant they needed Windows. And Microsoft understood that dependency precisely. Microsoft went to PC manufacturers and said something like this: for every PC you ship that is capable of running Windows, you pay us a licensing fee. Not for every PC that ships with Windows installed. For every PC that could run Windows, whether Windows is on it or not. The consequence was devastating for any alternative. If a PC manufacturer wanted to ship a machine with Linux instead of Windows, they still owed Microsoft the per-processor fee for that machine. Then they would also need to pay whatever the Linux vendor or distributor charged. Double billing. The manufacturer was effectively being taxed for choosing a competitor. For a PC manufacturer in that era, the decision was not which operating system is better. The decision was which operating system lets us ship the most units at the lowest cost. And Windows was the answer to that question every single time, not because it was superior, but because the contractual structure made the alternative economically punishing. Linux at that moment had no single company with the resources and distribution relationships to match what Microsoft had built. It could not guarantee a uniform customer experience across millions of different hardware configurations the way Microsoft could. And so, the default was set. Not by consumers choosing Windows after comparing it to alternatives, most consumers never made that choice. They bought a PC, and Windows was already there. That default compounded over time in exactly the way defaults always do. Most users had Windows. Software developers built for Windows. Businesses standardized on Windows because their software ran on it. Schools taught students on Windows. Repair technicians learned Windows. The entire ecosystem reinforced the original default and made switching increasingly costly for everyone in the chain. Where Linux actually lives now. The desktop default is held for 30 years and it is genuinely difficult to dislodge. Microsoft and Apple have decades of momentum, mature app ecosystems, customer support infrastructure, and marketing budgets that dwarf anything the Linux community can deploy. Modern Linux distributions have become dramatically more usable. Installation is simple, graphical environments are polished, hardware compatibility has improved substantially, and projects like Proton now allow many Windows games to run on Linux systems. But the network effects Microsoft built in the 1990s are still operating. Meanwhile, Linux has quietly conquered every other computing environment on the planet. The reason is consistent and clear. When engineers get to choose the operating system for something critical and expensive, when the cost of failure is high and the requirement for customization and control is non-negotiable, they choose Linux. Supercomputers choose Linux because they need to strip out unnecessary components, tune performance for custom hardware, and control every layer of the stack. Cloud infrastructure chooses Linux because server software was built expecting Linux, and optimizing large-scale deployments requires the level of control only Linux provides. The International Space Station chose Linux because when your computer fails 350 kilometers from the nearest repair shop, reliability is the only metric that matters. Desktop market share sits at around 2 to 4% globally for Linux, with Windows holding roughly 65% and Mac around 24% in the United States. Those numbers look like a loss, but they miss the scale of what Linux actually runs. Every time you load a website, the server delivering it almost certainly runs Linux. Every time you use a cloud service, the infrastructure underneath runs Linux. Every time someone at a national laboratory models a climate system or runs a particle physics simulation, the supercomputer runs Linux. And the phone in your pocket almost certainly runs Android, which is built on the Linux kernel. Linux is the best operating system in the world for environments where performance, reliability, and control are the requirements. It lost the desktop not because it could not compete technically, but because Microsoft built contractual infrastructure that made it almost impossible for PC manufacturers to ship anything else during the critical window when consumer defaults were being established. The fascinating irony is that Microsoft now runs Azure, one of the world's largest cloud platforms, almost entirely on Linux. The company that spent decades protecting Windows desktop dominance now operates the majority of its cloud infrastructure on the system it once worked so hard to exclude from the market. Linux runs the world from backstage. It always has. The question is whether you know about it. A $600 million nuclear weapons computer. A space station 300 kilometers up. Every supercomputer on the planet. All running Linux. If you want to understand how the world's most powerful technology actually works rather than just the version of computing that was sold to you, hit subscribe. We are going deep into the tech that never makes the consumer shelf. Drop a comment telling us whether you have ever run Linux and what you thought.